you had mentioned something earlier about this might be the wrong angle here, but epigenetics and you know, I had heard you talk not today, but in the past about like transgenerational violence,
Yeah.
and one of the things that you mentioned off camera last time we had our talk was you had spoken to some people in Black Lives Matter
Right.
about the impact of slavery and the
Right.
centuries of violence, and that gets encoded in people.
Yeah. You know what? The way that the epigenetics works is that if you have a certain group of genetic alleles, that is, you have a specific combination of alleles that make you vulnerable to stress, for example, and it makes you vulnerable to personality disorders and stress related disorders, but also affects addiction, obesity. And this was shown in an epigenetic study from the Swedish famines that occurred in the late 19th century, and what happened to the children and grandchildren, and what the effect it has on the children and grandchildren and great grandchildren of people from those famines, not only in Sweden but the ones in the 1930s in the Netherlands, the Dutch famines too, which was imposed. That the depending on when the the grandparents, parents, grandparents, great grandparents, how old they were and whether they were males or females during those famines, well, they end up having kids with these problems at a very high rate. So even though you may be eating normally, you're like wired for obesity, wired for addiction, and it's tied to something that happened to your great grandfather. And this is these epigenetic marks, that is, these permanent marks, which are mostly little methyl groups, a carbon with three hydrogens attached, very small chemical group that under stress is the cortisol. It gets into the brain and different parts of the body, and it attaches to the promoters, that is, the regulators of genes, like the stress genes, violence genes, obesity related genes, appetite, etc., and addiction. And it attaches to them. And instead of just attaching and then popping off, and what do I mean popping off? Well, every time you're exposed to like a cold virus, you get a new cold virus, your body will start keying up the lymphocytes to make antibodies. Well, those lymphocytes will undergo epigenetic changes with these CH3, these methyl groups attached, and for the amount of time, for 2 or 3 weeks, making new lymphocytes, new antibodies too, to fight the infection. Once the infection is over with, those methyl groups pop off and it reverses. So we all undergo these temporary epigenetic changes all the time. But if you have a certain kind of mix of genes and you undergo this, they're permanent. So they're always on. So you end up with somebody's permanently wired to be obese, permanently wired for addiction, permanently wired for violence. So this is the idea. When I gave a TED talk, it was 13 years ago, on this with this hypothesis that the source of violence around the world was transgenerational epigenetic violence, that it was kind of the gift that keeps giving. And so the idea is that in certain neighborhoods or regions, could be in the Gaza, it could be in Los Angeles, could be in New York, could be in different places in Africa, Asia, anywhere. It doesn't, the race or anything doesn't matter. But where the kids are being bullied constantly, seeing violence for at least 3 generations, 4 generations, and they're going to the mating chain. There will be different mating patterns probably. The girls will tend to be hooking up with tough guys, right, and having kids because those guys can protect them. But also at an epigenetic level, it'll start shifting the genetics. And so you see this even in something like the children of Holocaust and grandchildren of Holocaust victims who have the same nightmares that their grandparents who were in the Holocaust have. It's like the nightmare sequences were, the susceptibility was passed through the generations. So I had this, this idea of this, and this was a cause of continuing violence in what are romantically called, warrior cultures. It's not cute at all, right? But it happened in Turkey, Greece, Asia, the United States, maybe, and on and on. So, at any rate, there was this idea that, and I gave a talk in Ukraine, in London, about Russia. I used the example from Russia that they had, 300 years of czarist rule and then communist rule, which is just an extension of the czarist rule. And after all these, generations of abuse, that group, there'll be a certain large contingent who will vote in people who are dictators. They'll say, we want it. So you end up voting in people like Hitler, voting in people like Stalin. You're so used to the abuse that this becomes an expectancy, and it's a way for them to exist and be protected by, let's say, another bully, right? And so the idea. So I was talking to the people, some leadership from Black Lives Matters, and I said, you've got a case, and I gave them the Russian example, and there are other cases of this in Greece, in Turkey, et cetera, where you have this long series of abuse. And I said, if you look at slavery, that not blacks, but American blacks whose families were enslaved, they came as slaves, and so they have multiple generations. And of course, a lot of the, if you look at the rate of violence of people, not blacks in America, but inner city blacks whose grandparents and great grandparents, they come from slaves. So I said, look at, in order to survive, it could be the creation of kind of a protective warrior culture. So there's a higher level of aggression and violence. And he goes, the one guy goes, look at, I got to see if you can be on our, maybe on our advisory board. And I say, you're going to go back and tell these guys there's this old gray-haired white guy is going to be on the board. He says, no way, man. And he called me and said, sorry, we really can't do it. And it was kind of, there's too much to explain, all this biology. To me, it's just biology. There's not, it's explanatory, just looking for why things are. And usually what people do is try to deny that the reality exists, right? This is the way around it, or blame things that may not be blameworthy. But it was just an explanation, and but it's in many cultures could use this. So it's an idea more about could be tested, right? So this is something ripe for experimentation, but it's so politically hot. Who's going to do this? And I've talked to people. I know people who are C-suite people in very large corporations that I have known for some years, and they think it's very interesting. I give talks at the groups, and I said, you're going to go back and talk to your board and and your attorneys, and they said there's no way we can fund this because in some way it'll be interpreted as being either sexist or racist or protecting violent criminals, or it's all over the place from every angle. So it never gets funded, even though it's like a major problem throughout the world. And it's Eastern Europe and in parts of Asia, all over the world. So it's not race or gender specific at all, but it happened in certain places to certain people.
Yeah, that's it's a fascinating idea. Is there any way you can reverse the effects of that?
For these epigenetic marks that are, if they occur very early in life, the first few years of life, they tend to be permanent. If they happen later, they can pop off, or there are other brain circuits that are there. They're parallel brain circuits, and it seems that women have more of these parallel brain circuits to solve certain problems. So what appears to be plasticity, a lot of times is just using this parallel pathway that was always there. And so you lose one and then the other one comes online, or with different challenges, problems, for example, and puzzles, that you use different ways of solving them. And so, but if you have this early on, it's very difficult to reverse. And, I'm on the board of a company that's looking at doing this using, genetic editing. So, we're quite interested in this. But you always run up against the political issues and every angle, and very legitimate things about safety and ethics. And are we going to change the genome? Are we going to change humanity? Well, nature's doing that for us anyway, but and certainly our societies are. So, so we're looking at this and we just did a play on this, Reading Frankenstein, and we did a follow up. It was all about this issue, so we just did a play on this, CRISPR and other gene editing, and it surrounds the modern, monster, if you will, the creature. But we have a company that we started to look at this. I'm sure there are numerous companies that are looking at it for good, but anytime there's powerful methods, that they can always be used for what people consider bad. So it's always, that's why that's one of the reasons why you always see these pharmaceutical advances, which are only 10% improvements. It's only 5%, 10%. They're never big cures. And part of it is that, and part of it is a marketing thing and recovering funds. But in this case, it may be possible to reverse these things, like psychopathy and these different disorders, by knocking off those epigenetic marks and tweaking the genetic expression of these, these epigenetic interactions that end up being either socially pernicious or very pernicious to the person's sanity and mental health.